This series is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is an amazing app that allows its users to learn math and science interactively every single day, and you can start learning for free by going to brilliant.org/ForrestValkai or using the link in the description below. Brilliant is perfect for professionals who want to sharpen their skills, lifelong learners who want to deepen their knowledge, or just casual curiosity seekers who want to have fun and learn new stuff. And with exclusive new lessons added every single month, there's always more to learn. So keep exploring at brilliant.org/ForrestValkai. Get started for free and hurry because the first 200 people get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks so much to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Now let's learn science. So far in this series, we've talked about what evolution is, how we know it's real, and how it works. But what we haven't talked about is why anyone should care about evolution. After all, what difference does it make? What are the implications of evolution? What stories can it tell? How does it affect the world around us? How does it affect you or me? We know that evolution can shape an individual species, but no species exists in a vacuum. Could the evolution of one population affect the lives of another population, even if they're not directly related? Is all life actually connected together? And more importantly, what is life in the first place? Today, we're going to answer all those questions and more as we look at the big picture and see how all of biology is illuminated and all life on Earth is connected by evolution. If you've ever learned anything about evolution, there's a good chance that you've seen a diagram like this at some point. This is called a phylogeny, or an evolutionary tree. These trees can be powerful teaching tools because they succinctly boil down all of the evidence that we have and allow anybody to easily see the evolutionary history of and the relationships between different species. In order for any tool to be effective, however, you need to know how to use it properly. If you look just at the terminal ends of this chart, it would be pretty easy to assume that it's representing some sort of sequential relationship between the species depicted, as if a bird had turned into a cat that then became a human. But that's not what this phylogeny is actually saying. Remember, it's only showing histories and relationships. So we can rotate the nodes, the points where the different branches connect, and come up with a picture that looks very different, but actually says the exact same thing. Here's how you actually read one of these diagrams. This point here represents a creature that is not a cat and is not a human, but rather is the common ancestor of both cats and humans. It didn't look anything like a cat or a human, but its descendants, represented by the lines, eventually evolved into both cats and humans. Going back further on the tree, we find another creature that isn't a frog, and isn't a lizard, and isn't a bird, and isn't a cat, and isn't a human, and didn't look anything like any of us, but is all of our common ancestor. And its descendants eventually evolved into everybody here represented on this graph. Now right away, you'll notice that this simple little graph leaves a lot of details out. It doesn't show our relationships with sea sponges, or with palm trees, or with bacteria. It doesn't show all of the steps between our common ancestors and us, and it doesn't even show what our common ancestors were. But that's fine. It doesn't have to include all those details because that's not what this particular phylogeny is all about. This is simply showing that humans are more closely related to cats than they are to lizards or birds. Lizards and birds are more closely related to each other than they are to humans and cats. All 4 of us are equally related to frogs, and all 5 of us are equally related to fish. Other diagrams can cover other details, but that's all this diagram actually says. A phylogeny is a visual representation of millions of years of evolutionary history, so it makes sense that they would be pretty simplified. But to understand how this works a little bit better, let's build one from scratch. Here are 2 pairs of butterflies, 2 male and 2 female. These parents produce offspring and pass on their specific alleles. These offspring also reproduce and pass on the alleles that they got from their parents, more than likely with a few mutations along the way. Notice how some of them mate with the other offspring that we saw before, and some of them don't, because there are more than 2 butterflies in the world. Over time, these butterflies expand into a whole population, A species is made up of several of these populations that all exist at a certain time. Across countless generations, the allele frequencies of some of those populations start to differ from those of other populations through any one of the events that we talked about in the last episode, until eventually the genetic differences between them are so great that we can start to call them different species. This happens several times over millions of years, and so we draw a simple little graph about it. Do you see how this works? A phylogeny is just a super zoomed out picture of evolutionary time. And when you think about the last phylogeny that we looked at, comparing cats and humans and birds and lizards and fish, that phylogeny would be much more zoomed out than the one that we just made comparing butterflies to butterflies. But if you really want to understand the true beauty of evolution, you've got to apply that same kind of thinking to this phylogeny, showing the relationships of all living things to all other living things. And that is the most extraordinary fact about evolution. All life is related. And that's not a hyperbole or some poetic statement. I mean that completely literally. You are related to every other human being, and to bears, and to toucans, and to mushrooms, and to jellyfish, and to the bacteria crawling around on the bottom of your shoes, and to the earthworms in your backyard, and to every plant and animal in the densest rainforest or the most barren tundra, and to whatever you ate for dinner last night, and to the tree that made this desk. No matter where you go in the world, you are always at a family reunion, because all life shares a common ancestor. We call this ancestral organism Luca, the last universal common ancestor, the one thing which evolved into all of us. And as far as what Luca was and where it came from and how we know about it, that is more than enough for a whole other video. As mind-blowing as this perspective is, remember that these phylogenies are just summaries of evolutionary relationships and genetic connections. So while they do tell us an awful lot, they can't show us all of the other incredible implications of evolution. For that, you need to stop thinking in terms of trees and start thinking in terms of webs. Picture some cows. These cows have relationships with each other, otherwise we wouldn't have more cows. But these cows don't live in a void. They live in a field full of grass, which they need to eat to stay alive. This means that the cows also have a relationship with the grass, because one can't exist without the other. Ticks feed on the cows. They can't exist without the cows, which can't live without the grass, so the ticks are actually reliant on the grass, even though they can't eat it. Neither can the birds, which eat the ticks off of the cows. The birds need the grass to feed the cows so that the cows can attract the ticks. Looking down in the other direction, the cows also rely on the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, which bring water and nutrients to the grass. And they also rely on the worms, which keep the soil fresh and fertile so that the grass and the fungi can continue to grow. The worms affect the fungi, which affect the grass, which affect the cows, which affects the ticks, which affects the birds, and the birds have an effect on the worms too. The cows' guts are full of bacteria that allow them to digest the grass that they're eating. The cows can't live without the bacteria, and the bacteria can't live without the cows. After the cows have digested the grass, they poop, and the dung beetles need that poop to survive. And the coyotes that hunt the cows, and the viruses that infect the cows, and the vultures that pick the meat off of the cow bones, and the flies that lay their eggs in the leftover scraps of rotting cow are all intrinsically connected to the cows. And because these species are so deeply connected, any evolutionary change in one of them will have an impact on the rest of them. But it's not just the relationships between living things that are important. An ecosystem is all of the living things within a particular environment, and the environment, the physical surroundings, play a big role here as well. This is the whole point of ecology. Every single one of the biotic or living factors and the abiotic or non-living factors within an environment are crucially important. The web of life connects them all together. Every single little clam and coral and kelp and crustacean within a tide pool rely on the temperature and salinity of the water. They're also dependent on how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, as carbon dioxide mixes with water to form carbonic acid, altering the pH of the water that they're living in. Their lives are influenced by our impact on the climate and the water quality. And because around 80% of the oxygen in the atmosphere is produced in the ocean by photosynthetic sea life like phytoplankton, their suffering has an impact on every living thing that likes to breathe oxygen. And this is so incredibly important to remember, because usually when we talk about evolution, or anything in biology for that matter, we only talk about living things. But the truth is, every single living thing and every single non-living thing play a big part in the way that life works and the way that evolution works. In the last episode, we talked about selection pressure, differential sources of mortality or fertility within a particular environment. An organism's relationships within an environment and with the environment itself are what creates those selection pressures. The resources available to each organism, what they get to eat or drink or breathe or use as shelter, are all dependent on the environment and the other organisms around them, just as they have an effect on the other organisms around them as well. They're all affecting each other, and so they all evolve together. We call this reciprocal selection, which leads to coevolution, adaptation between interacting species as a result of that interaction. Coevolution can be based on either positive or negative selection pressures. An example of positive selection pressure is fruits that taste sweet and offer nutrients, so that animals will enjoy eating them and then poop out the seeds elsewhere so that the plant doesn't have to compete with its own offspring for resources. An example of negative selection pressure is the way that bats use echolocation to find and eat moths, so different species of moth have adapted to be able to hear those high-pitched sounds and avoid them with complicated flight patterns, or develop hair-like scales that absorb sound, or even make their own high-pitched sounds to throw the bats off their trails. That's called echolocation jamming, by the way, and it's one of the coolest things about tiger moths. In extreme cases, negative selection pressure can produce what's called an evolutionary arms race, where a prey species adapts new ways to overcome a predator species, which creates the selection pressures that causes the predator species to adapt new weapons against the prey species, and this feedback loop goes on and on and on. This is why we have animals like poison dart frogs, some of which are so absurdly toxic that they could kill 10 adult humans just by touching them. But the fire-bellied snakes which evolved alongside them are immune to their toxins and are now their only predators. And the most important and most amazing thing to remember about this is that none of this happened on purpose. None of these animals decided to evolve this way. This is all the result of natural selection, non-random selection of random mutations. The fruits that randomly tasted better got their seeds spread more reliably. The moths that randomly evaded bats better got to have more baby moths. And the snakes that randomly had more natural resistance to frog toxins got to eat and live. And now the whole population is represented by those mutants. So far, most of the relationships that I've talked about have been relatively pretty distant. But sometimes, evolution can make relationships that are actually quite personal. Symbiosis is the term for a deep physical relationship between two organisms, and there's actually 3 different ways that symbiosis can work. First, there's parasitism, which is where one organism benefits and the other is hurt. Tapeworms and malaria are great examples of parasites. Then there's mutualism, which is where both organisms benefit, like clownfish and sea anemones. The clownfish cleans the anemone, and the anemone protects the clownfish. Or lichens, which are where fungi and algae grow together. The algae feeds the fungus through photosynthesis, and the fungus protects the algae from dehydration. Then there's commensalism, which is where one organism benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. In fact, they might not even notice. Like barnacles that attach themselves to whales, or the tiny little mites that live on the bodies of larger insects. I should also point out here that there actually is some debate amongst biologists as to whether or not commensal relationships exist at all. Some argue that we're just not looking hard enough at those relationships, because those barnacles do cause a little bit of damage to the whale's skin, so strictly speaking, we should call them parasites. And those little mites do actually clean the bodies of the larger insects, so really we should call that mutualism. It's a fascinating thing to think about. And I should also point out that as extreme of a relationship as symbiosis can be, there's also an extreme form of symbiosis. Think about an anglerfish. They have a glowing lure that attracts other fish for them to eat. How do you suppose they do that? How does this fish produce light? The truth is, they don't. That lure is packed full of photobacteria, specialized bacteria that produce luminescent chemicals that attract food for the fish to eat, and in return, they get protection and nourishment inside the lure. These two species have evolved together to live in one body, a process called endosymbiosis. Another kind of endosymbiotic bacteria called rhizobium live inside the root cells of plants and capture nitrogen for them. And there are plenty of insect species like aster leafhoppers and aphids and tsetse flies, which are only able to survive on the food that they eat thanks to their own endosymbiotic bacteria. And yes, humans contain endosymbionts as well. For example, the mitochondria that live in almost every single one of our cells is the descendant from an early bacteria ancestor that was engulfed by a eukaryotic cell and kept on living within that cell and all of its descendants, producing the chemical energy that we need to live in exchange for protection. Does that sound a little bit far-fetched? Let's go over the evidence. Mitochondria are surrounded by two membranes instead of just one, the inner membrane being the one that they originally came with, and the outer one coming from our cells. Mitochondria have their own DNA, which isn't in the shape of a double helix like ours, but is circular like a bacteria's, and their gene sequence even matches that of a bacteria, rather than any animal. Mitochondria even reproduce inside of our cells all on their own, and they do so through binary fission like bacteria do. But the coolest thing about mitochondria is that as much as these markers show their history, they are now completely dependent on our cells to survive. They can't live without us, so they're not even considered bacteria anymore. In fact, they're not even considered alive. And everything that I just said about mitochondria also applies to chloroplasts. They were their own independent organisms, they have their own DNA, they're now just considered organelles even though they are still reproducing and still evolving. These endosymbionts found the most secure niche of all time. They literally evolved to not be alive anymore. This raises some important questions. If things like mitochondria and chloroplasts can't be considered alive, even though they're still functioning and reproducing, then what can be considered alive? We study cancer cells in laboratories all over the world. Some of those cells came from patients who have been dead for decades. But these are living human cells with human DNA, so does it make sense to say that these people are still alive and living in several different countries all at once? What about when we brush our teeth? We inevitably dislodge dozens of living human cells from our cheeks and our gums and our tongues. Are these all human deaths that we should mourn? These cells are certainly alive, but does the term life only mean something when it applies to a whole organism? What about the bacteria that I brush out as well? Those are certainly alive and they're whole organisms, so why is their life any more or less notable than mine? And possibly the most important question of all, what is life? Do you remember in the last episode when I said that there is no concrete definition for what a species is? There is also no concrete definition for what life is. Biology is the study of life, and yet we have no single functional definition of what life actually is. We have several attempts at a definition, but just like our shoddy concepts of species, they all have their flaws. Now, as you might imagine, it gets pretty tricky to talk about life when we don't actually have a definition for what life is. So instead, what we have is a list of 7 qualifications that allow us to determine whether something is alive or not. Number 1 on that list is form and function. You can't just be an amorphous blob. In fact, things like slime molds that you might think of as amorphous blobs are actually quite organized. Number 2 is growth and development. You can't just pop into existence and then pop back out. There have to be set stages in your life in order for it to be considered a life. Number 3 is regulation. You have to be able to maintain homeostasis, or a stable internal environment that's isolated and different from your external environment. Number 4 is energy conversion. You can't be an island all to yourself. You need to take in energy from elsewhere and use it to keep yourself alive. Either through eating, or through photosynthesis, or through chemosynthesis, however you do it, you have to be able to convert energy. Number 5 is response to stimuli. You have to be a part of the world. You can't just be totally numb. Even plants, which are notoriously bad at things like getting up and walking around, still respond to stimuli like light and chemical signals and even predators in their own way. Number 6 is reproduction. One of the hallmarks of life is that it makes more copies of itself. And when you follow that, it leads you to number 7, evolution. All life undergoes evolution, changing slightly from one generation to the next. That's right, evolution is so central to biology that it's literally one of the defining characteristics of life itself. Oh, and as far as mitochondria and chloroplasts and whatnot are concerned, they've actually lost the genes that would have allowed them to survive on their own outside of our cells, so they can't maintain homeostasis, therefore they're not considered alive. But wait just a minute. One of the qualifications for life was reproduction. So what if I'm infertile, or I just never choose to have kids? Does that mean that I'm not technically alive? And another part of that list was evolution, which makes sense on a big scale, but it doesn't make sense for individual organisms because individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. So how can we use evolution to determine whether one thing is alive? And what about viruses? They barely do 3 things on that list, and yet they are hugely important in biology, and they're evolving all the time. So are they alive or not? The thing that you have to remember here is that lists are not definitions. Not every single living thing has to do everything on that list. The list is just a set of general rules and guidelines that help us to categorize and understand things, as is pretty much everything else in biology. And as far as viruses are concerned, the general consensus right now is that they are not considered alive, but it is still somewhat debated and they don't seem to care what we think. Now we could just end the discussion right here, but we haven't really answered the question now, have we? What is life? Even if we don't have a definition, we can't just be satisfied with a list of things that life does. If we're gonna talk about life seriously, we need to at least be able to talk about what life is made of. All matter in the universe is made of atoms. There are 118 different kinds of atoms that we know about so far, but you only need a tiny fraction of that number to understand life. In fact, just 6 elements, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, make up the most common elements in biological macromolecules. Over 98% of all life on Earth are just those 6 elements. Throw in calcium and you've got over 99% of you. And if you add a few trace elements like iron and molybdenum and copper and zinc, things that make up less than 1/10% of your entire body, you've got a fully functional human. To help make sense of how chemicals can make living things, think about fire for a second. Fire is a chemical reaction. It's the conversion of hydrocarbons and oxygen into carbon dioxide and water. So when you light a candle, you haven't given fire to something, you've just started a chemical reaction. And when you blow that candle out, the fire didn't go anywhere, it just ceased to exist. Even though all of the chemicals for the fire might still be there, the reaction, the fire itself, has stopped. And life is the same way. It's a series of chemical reactions, or what you might call chemistry in motion. When you're born, you didn't gain life from anywhere, and when you die, the life doesn't go anywhere. The chemical reactions, life itself, just started and then stopped. And just like how even after the fire is gone, the chemicals that produce it are useful for other chemical reactions, after life is gone, the chemicals that produce it are useful for other living things. Plants, animals, fungi, and billions of microorganisms all rely on the chemical energy contained within our bodies. So much so that even our waste products when we're alive, our sweat, our poop, our carbon dioxide, are all vital nutrients for countless living things. Atoms make molecules, which make macromolecules like lipids and nucleic acids and proteins and carbohydrates. Those macromolecules make organelles, which make cells. Cells combine to make tissues. Tissues make organs. Organs sync up to make organ systems, and organ systems make organisms like you and me. But that's not all. A group of one kind of organism living together is called a population. All of the different populations of different organisms living together in one area is called a community. The community, plus all of the abiotic factors around them, is what makes up an ecosystem. Ecosystems exist within biomes, and biomes all strung together make up the biosphere, the living Earth, the sum total of the entire planet and every living thing on it. Every single level of this hierarchy is critical, down to the very last atom, because the atoms that make life move through what we call biogeochemical cycles, predictable pathways by which carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and all of the other things that make you and every other living thing, both past and present, cycle through every single ecosystem on the planet. It's where the matter that made you came from, and it's where it'll go after you're gone. This planet, and every living thing on it, and every atom in it, and every force acting upon it are all inseparably connected. And this is the greatest lesson in all of biology. You are a part of the tree of life. You are related to every living thing around you. You are one link in a chain that extends for billions of years, all leading up to you. And you are also part of the web of life. You rely on the existence of countless other organisms to survive, and countless other organisms rely on you just the same. This entire biosphere is just as much a part of you as you are a part of it. All the laws of physics and chemistry that form this planet and that continue to shape it today are also acting on every atom in your body at this very moment, just as they have for your ancestors and your relatives for billions of years. You are a character in an epic and ongoing story, And whether you like it or not, you are a shaper in that story. And now, you have the opportunity to see that story in a brand new light, in the light of evolution. Thank you so much for watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, and all the other stuff you do here on YouTube. Have an awesome rest of your day, and never stop learning. Bye-bye!